Good morning again, dear colleagues. We will now start with the item 5 on our agenda. If I can ask everybody please to take the seat. I would like to welcome today in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran, His Excellency Javad Zarif, as well as the delegation from Iran that has joined us here today. I would first of all like to thank Minister Zarif for accepting our invitation to address the Foreign Affairs Committee. This is his first visit to the European Union institutions after the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action marked its implementation day on the 16th of January 2016. That is the day in which the International Atomic Energy Agency officially confirmed that Iran has fulfilled all its engagements listed in the JCPOA's first phase, triggering the lifting of United Nations, EU and United States nuclear-related sanctions. The signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action opens a new phase of opportunities for EU-Iran engagement. The European Parliament has supported EU-Iranian relations, including the opening of the EU's delegation in Tehran and the restarting of negotiations for the conclusion of an EU-Iran trade and cooperation agreement. In this regard, we would be interested in having your views, Mr. Minister, on potential areas of future EU-Iran cooperation, and I will also recall a very important and timely visit of the delegation of the Foreign Affairs Committee led by our chairman just before the conclusion of the negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal, which was also a contribution of the European parliamentary diplomacy to the wider engagement of the EU institutions, and in particular the efforts done by High Representative Federica Mogherini and other countries who were closely involved in the negotiation process. Mr. Minister, in recent months we have seen a concerning deterioration of the security situation in the Middle East. The region is in turmoil. Developments such as the rise of Daesh or the conflicts in Yemen and Syria and the migration flows resulting from them have put Europe and the countries in the neighbourhood in a difficult situation. To provide you with the most recent input, two of our delegations during last week, one chaired by Mr. Brok, visited Egypt, and the other, which I had the privilege to chair, visited Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And all of the issues of the stability or instability, better to say, in the Middle East, in the Arab Peninsula and Northern Africa were on the agenda of our discussions with the highest interlocutors in those three countries. Minister Zarif, the European Union and Iran face common challenges, and although we do not always share the same views on how to address them, we should strive to find ways to solve them. I would like to hear your views on these and other matters of common interest and concern, including the internal situation in Iran, including the protection of human rights. The structure of our debate is usually envisaged that you, as our guest, have the opportunity to give an address for about 10 to 15 minutes. Since it is your first appearance and given so many topics, I would agree that it is 15 minutes. Then the members will have an opportunity to ask you questions, each in a succinct manner, because I see already there is a huge interest, for about a minute and a half, and then you will be able at the end to wrap up in a joint address your answers to all the concerns. Mr. Minister, the floor is yours. Please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning to everybody. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to have this opportunity to be with you, and let me begin by expressing my appreciation not only for giving me the opportunity to be here, but also for the support that you have provided at the European Parliament to diplomacy and to the work that was carried out so brilliantly and ably by both Catherine Ashton and later by Federica Mogherini, not to mention the work that was done by Javier Solana before both of them. I think both the European Union and Iran can take pride in the fact that we were able to make diplomacy work. Because for us, diplomacy is the alternative to very unpleasant options that are available but are not necessarily conducive to producing results that are acceptable. We were able to make diplomacy work because we were able to change the paradigm through which we approach this issue. We had started dealing with the Iranian nuclear issue with the European Union in 2003, and I had the honor of being a member of the team that started negotiations with E3. At that time, it wasn't +3, just E3. And then it was later, because of the referral, in our view unjustifiable referral of the issue to the Security Council, that other 3 permanent members of the Security Council who were not members of E3 were added to this. So EU can take credit for beginning this process, and had it been the same paradigm when we started the process, we could have ended it in 2005 just with E3. We didn't need the permanent members of the Security Council involved. But for whatever reason, particularly maybe because of the politics at that time in the United States, we were not able to do that. But what is important is to look at why we were able to reach a conclusion and why we were able to implement that conclusion in spite of all the naysayers. And you heard them all, that we will not be able to achieve an outcome, and once we achieved the outcome, a lot of people were saying that we would not be able to implement it. We did both, and we did both well ahead of time. Nobody expected us to implement the Iranian part of the obligations before May or April, but we managed to do it basically in December, having the IAEA confirmed that we had finished all the requirements by January 16th, and that is why, as of January 16th, all the sanctions which were related to Iran's nuclear program have been lifted. The reason we were able to do that was that we redefined the problem in a way that enabled us to resolve it. The problem had been defined in a diametrically opposed ways by Iran and the West, particularly by the United States. The United States had a stated policy that Iran should not have any nuclear program. They called it a nuclear weapon program. We always believed that our program was a peaceful program, but the United States insisted. And if you go back to the 1990s, the United States was even against Iran building a power plant, a nuclear power plant. And that is why probably the Bushehr power plant that we built holds the record in terms of the length of time it took to complete it, because in each stage of the way the United States intervened in order to prevent a possible contractor from engaging with Iran. So the way the problem had been defined by the United States in the beginning was that Iran should not have a nuclear program, period. And that made it almost impossible for Iran to accommodate that objective, because accommodating that objective would have been tantamount to Iran abandoning its right. In 2013, when we resumed negotiations, we were able to redefine our objective. We defined the objective as Iran having a nuclear program that will always remain peaceful. In that way, instead of having 2 diametrically opposed objectives, we managed to entertain the same objective, which we could believe it was our objective, and the United States and the West could accept as their objective. And the reason for that was that the United States and some of its Western allies had come to the conclusion that it was impossible to prevent Iran from having a nuclear program, because Iran had the infrastructure, Iran had the knowledge, Iran had the capabilities. So they accepted that Iran should have a program that is transparent, that will never produce nuclear weapons. That was an objective that could be entertained. And accepting a new objective, accepting an objective which was just a redefinition of the old objective. The old objective was that Iran should never have a nuclear weapons program. The new objective is still the same. We were able to redefine, restate, rearticulate the objective in a way that we could accommodate each other. And that is how we were able to resolve the issue. The paradigm is extremely important. The paradigm is extremely important because we live now in a new international environment where globalization makes it impossible for you to have security when others are insecure, to have prosperity where others live in poverty. That is the nature of a globalized world. We cannot, simply it is impossible to gain at the expense of others. A zero-sum game, a game that is a win-lose game, will end up making everybody lose. So we either work for a positive-sum game, where everybody will win, or we end up having a negative-sum game, where everybody will lose. And if we understand that real important new dimension of the globalized world, then we can apply it to other issues. We can use the success of the nuclear diplomacy, for which we can all take pride, and apply it to the situation in the region. See if we can redefine the challenges and opportunities in the region in a way that is conducive to a positive-sum game, rather than a negative-sum game or a zero-sum game. Now, in our region, we face challenges, we have opportunities. Opportunities for development, opportunities for free flow of oil, opportunities for more stable oil prices. That is now becoming apparent even to the consumers, that a more stable oil market is in the interest of everybody. Opportunities for greater exchange between peoples of the region, and challenges. Challenges of extremism, challenge of sectarianism, challenge of violence. If we start defining them in terms that are capable or give rise to possible accommodation by all, then we can address them. However, if we start looking at these problems from a zero-sum perspective, that is, if Iran and other players in the region or players outside the region look at their gain in terms of the loss of others, look at their achievement in terms of disaster for others, then it would be impossible to accommodate each other. I believe it is possible to start redefining these problems. I believe it is possible to start looking at the principles which we can all share. Let's look at the Persian Gulf. Persian Gulf is our lifeline, and the lifeline of a lot of other countries in the region. Persian Gulf is becoming an area where a lot of challenges may emerge, from extremism to volatility in oil prices, to navigation, to environment. You know, around the Persian Gulf, everybody is building nuclear power plants. So nuclear safety is a common challenge in the Persian Gulf. So if you look at this particular problem area and see if you can come up with a new redefinition of problems in a way that makes it amenable to resolution. And then for people living in Europe, it's easy to think about the Helsinki process, where you came up with a number of principles which everybody should accept as ticket to enter the new process, and a number of confidence-building areas where each side should engage in order to build confidence and in order to move forward. I think by doing that, we can redefine the region, redefine the problems in the region in a way that we can resolve them. And I think it is quite possible. We can all agree on these principles. Principle of respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, inviolability of international borders, rejection of interference in the internal affairs of others. Even we can go further, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, zone free from weapons of mass destruction. All of these principles we can all share. Then we can have cooperation in the area of environment, exchange of people, exchange of tourists, visitors, and then addressing the common challenges, fighting sectarianism, fighting terrorism, fighting extremism. These are principles and security and confidence-building options in the area of economy, free flow of oil, maintaining some stability in the oil market, which is commonly shared by all countries in the Persian Gulf. Then coming to security, we can deal with weapons, we can deal with military visits, we can deal with fighting extremism and terrorism, and then dealing with social problems, we can deal with sectarianism, we can deal with closer affinity between the peoples of the region, and then by such redefinition, we can move towards its resolution. I believe that is necessary if we want to use the nuclear case in order to have a different outlook for our region. Unfortunately, what has been the case in our region is that people have defined their interest in a way to exclude others. And as long as that is the definition of the interest that is given in our region, we are not going to find a resolution. I believe the challenges are big enough for all of us, and the European Union is facing the same challenges. You are seeing the outcome of the crisis in Syria in terms of the waves of refugees that are coming your way. But that's the beginning of the problem, because you cannot contain extremism in any part of the world. Extremism is bound to spread. You cannot contain it in one country, you cannot contain it in one region. The ideology of hatred and extremism will spread. And we need to find ways of dealing with that. And it cannot be a unidimensional approach. We cannot deal with this from a military perspective alone, although military may be necessary to deal with the hard core of the problem. We need a cultural approach, we need an interreligious dialogue approach, we need an economic approach to deal with unemployment, to deal with deprivation, to deal with disenfranchisement that are happening in our region. So if all of us, just to say the last word before my 15 minutes is up, if all of us understand that we're facing the same problem, that we're facing a common challenge, that we need a common response to this common challenge, then we have taken the first step of addressing it. If anybody believes that is somebody else's problem, that they can deal with it, that they have to find a way to deal with it, that you have to find a way to deal with refugees, and we have to find a way to deal with the extremism and sectarianism, then we'll never resolve the problem. We need to all understand that we are in the same boat, and we will either sink together or sail together. And that is the final analysis of our globalized world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister, for being so punctual. It's 9:44. So far we have 25 demands for the floor, as I have envisaged. So, dear colleagues, to be collegial and parliamentarian, please be so kind to speak maximum 1 minute. We've done this exercise before. I know it's complicated, but if we want to give the opportunity to everyone to pose a question to Minister Zarif, that is the only way we can handle this exercise. So, for the first time, I might have to use the hammer. We will start with Richard Howitt, our colleague from S&D, who is a rapporteur of this committee on the report of the EU strategy towards Iran after the nuclear deal. Richard, please.
Thank you, President. I'll be as concise as possible, but I'd be grateful for an extra 30 seconds. Welcome to Foreign Minister Zarif with Mr. Brok. I was proud to take part in that delegation that came to Tehran, and I hope we played our own small part in enabling the nuclear deal to be achieved. I'm now proud to be the rapporteur. I think that's going to be a difficult process, but one that I hope can be constructive and successful. And I say to you what I've said already in this committee, that we want a constructive report. We want to use it to look at different ways of re-establishing relations between the EU and Iran at a broad-based level. We're not going to reopen discussions about the nuclear deal. Our friends in the European Commission and Ms Mogherini are engaged in that with you, and that's not for us to second-guess the management of that deal. But on issues, including some that you've talked about today, of economic interest, trade, environmental issues, security concerns, there is an agenda for us there to follow. And let's be very clear, we do have some differences. We're not going to try and parade those in a destructive way. On human rights, I'm pleased that there is a political dialogue where human rights is being discussed between us, and we want to deal with that issue in a constructive way. Two very short questions. Your 4-point plan on Yemen, I think it's very important we hear from you a little more about that plan because of our dire concerns about the humanitarian situation there. And secondly, at the Munich Security Conference on Friday, you said that you did foresee Saudi Arabia and Iran being able to work together on security issues. Please say a little bit more to us in this difficult context about that.
Thank you, Richard. This was really an exception. Arnaud Danjean, co-coordinator PPE.
Oui, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to exchange views. I would like to ask about the second part of your comments, so not so much the nuclear deal, which is somewhat behind us, even though it's going to be very closely monitored. I'd like to talk about the instability in the Gulf region. You talked about the problem of sectarianism, exclusion, and extremism. You know, one of the problems in Iraq, and that has really been at the heart of the proliferation of a number of terrorist groups, is the sectoral policy that was put in place by the previous Iraqi government. And some people talk about a certain Iranian influence behind this government. In this region, in order to establish trust and to move away from the problems we have at the moment, we have this issue of interference. Now, we understand that Iran has certain prerogatives, defending its national interests and its territorial integrity, but what would you say to those in the region who talk about going beyond defence and interference, such as in Yemen and Syria?
I'll stand up, please, on behalf of the ECR.
Mr. President, welcome, Foreign Minister. My group, the ECR, also welcomes better relations between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the European Union, and we accept the nuclear agreement, but remain extremely vigilant and cautious, and it will require maximum monitoring internationally. Two questions. First of all, on the UN Security Council Resolution 1929, which prohibits ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads being used by Iran. Your defence minister recently is reported to have stated that the EMAD long-range ballistic missile will be unveiled next year, although it is believed to be capable of being nuclear weapon or weaponised or carrying a nuclear payload. Why does Iran need long-range ballistic missiles, and who are they targeted at? On the issue of human rights, I was particularly strong in my condemnation of the recent brutal execution of the Shia cleric Nimr al-Nimr, which was totally unacceptable. But nevertheless, last year, Iran also executed more than 800 prisoners, including Sunni preachers, and currently detains bloggers and journalists. Baha'is and Christians, and I met some of them in my constituency of London, are particularly oppressed by your government. And particularly those who have converted from Islam and deemed to be apostates. When will Iran respect the Islamic tradition that there is no compulsion in religion? That is in the Shura, as I understand it. And can you also tell me what is the status of the LGBT community in Iran? Thank you.
Charles, Mr. Weigel, ALDE, please.
Spoštovani gospod minister, slišali boste tudi slovensko besedo.
Minister, you'll be able to hear some Slovenian now. I appreciated the fact that you acknowledged the role of diplomacy and the role of the EU in the negotiations. We think Iran is a particularly important state in this region, and I'd just like to make the following comments. Could you perhaps specify the two ideas you raised? So, firstly, measures to increase trust and confidence. In relations with Saudi Arabia, could you envisage a confidence-building process, certain confidence-building measures? Secondly, you haven't really touched upon the issue of human rights in your country. Could you perhaps tell us, are any changes to be expected? Every day here in Parliament, we talk to representatives of the Iranian diaspora, so we hear a certain amount of information. I think the Islamic Republic of Iran needs to develop into a more tolerant society, and I'd like to know how you wish to contribute to that.
Mr. Zarif, the agreement of last June and the lifting of the sanctions removed Iran from the isolation imposed by the West, and we're expecting from Iran to use constructively its important role, not only in the Middle East, but also in the global economy. The situation in the Middle East deteriorates daily, you know this, and we know that, and conflict has characteristics of religions, and both sides are using the religious differences in order to create various wars and crises in order to control the area better. You are accused, together with other countries, with Saudi Arabia and Turkey, that you are supporting such conflict and you support specific regimes. Last month, it was accepted that Iran has trained 200,000 fighters, approximately, to help the arrival of Prophet Mahdi that will prepare for the day of judgment. I would like to ask, do you believe really that with this strategy you are giving an answer to the alliance of Saudi Arabia, that you try to reduce the tension in the area, that you promote stability, peace, and for the people of the area? And another question. A few days ago you said you want to cooperate with Saudi Arabia, but 2 days after the agreement for a truce in Syria, Turkey started bombarding the Kurds, and Saudi Arabia is sending aircraft to Incirlik base and leaves open to sending troops in Syria together with Saudi Arabia. How do you judge this, taking into account the strategic interest of Iran with this country? And the head of the Mr. Eskandari, before losing his life in May 2014 in Syria, he said that the elite of the guards of the Islamic Resolution were fighting in Syria in order to strengthen the forces of Assad. And Iran... Thank you.
Mr. Buchner, please.
Vielen Dank, Herr Minister, dass Sie zu.
Thank you very much, Minister, for coming to talk to us. I'd like to thank you for the very positive role that Iran played in the nuclear negotiations and with regard to the non-proliferation treaty. I think there are a whole range of areas in which we could work very well together. For example, environmental problems. I think we have expertise on both sides here. I think we could work well when it comes to energy and renewable energy. My specific question, though, could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about Iran's position with regard to the situation in Syria? Thank you.
Fabio Castaldo, prego, minuto 15.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman, and welcome, Minister. It's a great pleasure to have you here, because I'm one of those who welcomed the conclusion of the agreement with Iran. And as you pointed out, that could change the course of history. But the reality today is that the Persian Gulf and the entire Middle East is devastated by proxy wars. Now, as you know, there is massive economic potential, but we can't limit ourselves to economic issues. How do you think you could relaunch a dialogue with Saudi Arabia? That's a question I have. Also, given the collapse in oil prices, and this also relates to oil quotas, production quotas. And then a second point, human rights. Alas, I do have to point out that even today, you're one of the major users of the death penalty across the world. There are thousands of cases over the last couple of years. Can we expect that your reformist government will make a significant step towards a moratorium of the death penalty during the coming years? We hope to see that.
A bit more minutes than envisaged. From now on, 1 minute, and I'll cut off all the speakers. Mr. Kellam, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Foreign Minister, I would like to welcome your message and your presence here. But would you agree that all boils down to trust? Because sanctions on Iran have also applied on the basis of human rights abuses and for supporting terrorism. Would you agree that the litmus test for restoring trust will be improving human rights situation in Iran, also improving the situation of religious and national minorities? Take one case. Young woman Athena Faragani, 29 years old, was sentenced for 12 years for posting a caricature on Facebook protesting against new laws that curb women's rights. And can you explain why thousands of candidates for the next Majlis have been disqualified by Supreme Authority? Thank you.
Thank you. Tuna, Mr. Khan, 1 minute.
Your Excellency, Assalamu alaikum and Khush Amdeen here to the European Parliament. I'm very pleased to see you here at the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm pleased that we're moving towards the implementation of the nuclear deal. The process will stabilize the Middle East and making it not just safer but also more prosperous. I'm also very happy to hear what you have said this morning to us all. But beyond this, as somebody who has traveled the region well, who knows Iran and its people, I would like to make two remarks to you. Your nation has experienced a revolution against an authoritarian leader. You know what it means when people are determined to no longer suffer oppression and corruption. In this context, I need to ask you about Iran's role in the ongoing conflict in Syria. Syrians are oppressed in a way similar to the Iranians were under the Shah. The Ba'athist regime, first under the father who flattened cities, and now the son who's flattening the whole country.
Dear Afas, thank you. 1 minute has gone very quickly. I think Minister understood the point on Syria.
I will just finish this off then. It's basically
Please.
How can we help? And the second quick one is simply about, I've been to the GC countries, and the issue which is coming again and again is about interference. And they basically think it's a revolutionary
We got the
cause.
message, interference on Madame Fotiga. Thank you.
Thank you. I strongly echo Charles Tannock's statement on executions. Minister, I would like to ask about your target energy mix in Iran. Is nuclear energy so much needed really in future? And secondly, about Syria. You face great losses there in terms of life of military, Iranian military engaged there. What do you think about future strategy of engagement in Syria and future of coalition?
Thank you. Mr. Payet, please.
Thank you very much. Dear Minister, what you and Iran sees as the most efficient tactics and strategy to combat Daesh or ISIS? And my second question is that now, after the deal on nuclear issues, do you see any ground, any possibilities also to move forward in your relationship with Israel? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hadji Georgiou.
I welcome you as well, Mr. Foreign Minister. the Foreign Affairs Committee is addressing some points that you didn't mention here in your speech. Human rights in your country. You're a country with a large number of executions, taken into account the population and see the percentage of executions versus the population. Many are killed because they are accused of crimes, and the executions are taking place publicly. On this, would you be kind enough to give us an answer and to give some details in your answer? Thank you.
Madam Lunacek, please.
Thank you. Prime Minister Zarif, you said yourself that you're so close. Well, I'm sitting behind the camera, so you cannot see me. Thank you. So, here I am. You yourself said that for Syria, a military solution is not the only way possible, and there has to be more than a military solution. Now, you yourself and your country are involved with Assad in the fight, not only against ISIS in Syria and around, but also against the moderate opposition in Syria. So why are you not telling Assad that this de facto military solution is the wrong way from the beginning? That's my first question. The second, as Vice President of this Parliament for the Sakharov Prize, I would like to refer to Jafar Panahi and Nasrin Sotoudeh, two Sakharov Prize winners of 2012. When will Jafar Panahi be able to make films again? Because he still cannot do that. And in general, the Helsinki process was great, but since then, the interference in internal affairs on human rights is not something that is acceptable anymore. And I hope you also understand that. Human rights are universal.
Thank you, Ulrike. Human rights message. Mr. Carver, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Foreign Minister. I'll be interested to hear whether Iran would consider support for a possible federal settlement for the Yemen. What are your views on the possibility of Saudi Arabian ground forces in Syria to counter Shia influence? Given their record in the Yemen, would such an approach complicate matters further? Last year, the commander of the Basij militia of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard stated, erasing Israel off the map is not negotiable. Bearing in mind your comments only a few minutes ago, will you in front of this committee condemn those comments and respect the right of Israeli sovereignty? Earlier this month, the US DEA, in cooperation with authorities in Europe, uncovered a massive Hezbollah drug and money laundering scheme. Why does Iran continue to actively support this terror organisation? Where are we on time? Between January and November last year, Iran was the only country in the Middle East to execute more people than Saudi Arabia, including preachers and religious activists. Will Iran ever abolish the death penalty? And finally, turning my attention towards the shrinking Jewish community in Iran, can you clarify whether Jewish schools in Iran are still forced to open on a Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath? And do you have any views on why the Jewish newspaper that criticises policy was subsequently
Thank you, Mr. Carver.
Thank you.
Onorevole Borghezio, prego.
Grazie Presidente. Signor Ministro.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister, we all appreciated the words you spoke against extremism and terrorism. Now, your country wants to cooperate with Europe. We are really the targets of ISIS. What advice could you give us? Do you believe that the EU response to the terrible threat that we face is adequate? Now, moving on to economic relations, well, I'd like to thank you for the openings that have been given to the businesses from my country, particularly in the railway sector, although I think it would be important to open up more to SMEs. But the question, when it comes to the supply of oil and gas, don't you think it's time to implement modern methods of supply and direct supply to those countries, for example, in the south of Europe?
Our colleague Epitedeias, please.
Welcome, Your Excellency. I would like your political assessment for the moment chosen by Saudi Arabia to provoke your country. Do you feel that the conflict between the two countries will have general consequences in your relations with the European Union and the United States? And if yes, how will you address this issue? Thank you.
Very much. Mr. Stetina, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Your Excellency, Minister, I'm very glad that you accepted our invitation to come and appear before this committee. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, gentlemen of the delegation. The European Union is built on a universal protection of human rights, and that's why I'd like to focus on them. Iran is today the country with the highest number of executions per capita in the world. Several hundred Iranian citizens were hanged in last year alone. The number of executions is growing alarmingly year on year. How does your government intend to address this problem? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Gomez.
Minister, good to see you here. I'm one of the people who are really hopeful that indeed the agreement will also turn into better interaction between us and Iran, and also in terms of progress in human rights. Women's rights, the rights of Baha'is, the death penalty, all these questions need to be addressed. And of course, as has already been referred, the rights of authors such as Mr. Pathai, which only raised the name of Iran. But I'd like to ask you in particular, what is your view of the latest developments on the Syrian conflict? When I visited Iran in 2013, I got the feeling that Iran intervention in the conflict was not really to save Assad, but to actually deny the ground to Saudi Arabia. And I must say that at that time I also went to Saudi Arabia and did not find an attitude like the one I found in Iran, willing to talk, willing to solve the issues. So what is your perspective now on the latest developments on Syria, especially considering that you and Russia are there actually supporting
Thank you,
Assad?
Madam Gomez. Mr. Korwin-Mikke, please.
Thank you. Your Excellency, thank you for your splendid exposé. I can inform you that 77% of Poles support the death penalty. There is no democracy, of course, we are under occupation of the European Union, but we support your position. We support also your efforts in Syria when you were fighting from the beginning with the caliphate, so-called caliphate, and we hope that you can fight the ISIS to the end. And third, I don't understand why Pakistani government and Israeli government can have nuclear weapons and Iran cannot. We don't understand it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Foreign Minister, even I want to raise the question of human rights. During the 2.5 years of Mr. Rouhani's presidency, at least 2,300 citizens have been hanged. Iran is executing more minors than any other country in the world, according to a new report from the Amnesty International. Homosexuals are being hanged in Iran. Religious minorities like Baha'is and Christians are harassed and prosecuted. Mr. Foreign Minister, how long time will these terrible acts continue in your country?
Thank you. Onorevole Panzeri.
Grazie della sua presenza.
Thank you for being here, Minister. Just one question. The nuclear agreement has reshuffled the cards in the region and has made a new geopolitical situation possible in which your country can be a protagonist. The current Washington leadership believes that leadership in the region needs to be based on a balance of powers between Iran, Saudi Arabia and Israel. I don't know how easy that would be to achieve given the situation in Syria and Yemen. I wanted your opinion on that.
Alain, bitte.
Thank you, Minister. I'm glad that we got this deal with your country. I'm glad that sanctions could be lifted, and I'm glad that we resume economic ties and can take part in your country's modernization process. I'm glad that your government will lose the domestic argument that social and economic hardship is due to sanctions. And I'm confident that your great nation will increasingly demand from their own rulers their inherent rights and freedoms that you owe them in order to fully launch the human potential that you need to get your country forward. With regard to Syria, as we speak, we see the indiscriminate slaughtering of civilians by Syrian and Russian airstrikes on hospitals and schools and residential areas. Do you really think that there is a long-term perspective for your country siding with Assad and Russia, or don't you think that by actively pursuing a solution, it serves you better in the long run? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our colleague Freund, bitte.
Yes, I appreciate very much, Mr. Foreign Minister, that you came to the European Parliament. My question about the relations with Israel have been asked, so I will yield the rest of my time. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank. Onorevole Cesar.
Sì, grazie. Benvenuto, Ministro.
Thank you. Welcome, Minister. As Europeans and Italians, we're very proud of what's been done. The Italian government and Mrs. Mogherini made a major contribution to the agreement, and I hope that the agreement will have positive economic effects, but will also help to stabilize your area of the world. I hope it will play a positive effect. But my question, don't you think that the influence, the overwhelming influence of the Shia is sending the Sunnis in Iraq, for example, into the arms of ISIS? And a further question, do you think that Mr. Assad can represent the future of Syria, or do you have the idea perhaps of splitting Syria into three parts? Thank you.
Peterle, izvolite.
Mr. Minister, you said sink or sail, win or fail. My question is, how would you define the next step after encouraging step with the agreement? Then my second question, partnerships are based on shared values and principles. Can you foresee more common understanding of fundamental human rights which were mentioned by my colleagues in the future between Iran and the EU? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Loise. Now I give the floor to Madame Theokaros, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I feel that most of the points I want to raise have been mentioned. I would like to mention one point only.
Okay. Thank you. Εγώ θα σταθώ μόνο στο
I would like to mention the death penalty and the executions. I think that the picture of Iran will change dramatically if you abolish the death penalty and if you give more democratic freedom to your citizens. Because your people is made up of a mixture of people that are very highly educated people, and they want democracy and freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Minister, you wouldn't believe, but this is it. We exhausted the whole list of speeches. I thank all the colleagues for really a disciplined performance today. This will be a model for the future similar occasions. Just a small note as a shadow rapporteur to Mr. Howitt on behalf of EPP. It would also be important for us to reiterate generally the issue of protection of human rights. This is something that you've heard is a critical element for Iran's international perception. But also, I would appreciate a little bit more elaboration on the plans which you have to de-escalate tensions with Saudi Arabia, as well as reference to the war in Yemen, which is of great concern for all of us. Mr. Minister, now you have about 30 minutes for a comprehensive address. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm grateful to all of you for your questions and comments that were made. And I'll take them in a spirit of dialogue and greater understanding, and I hope that you will take my frank responses to your questions in the same spirit. Let me begin in the order of priority, probably. If I take the number of questions, most questions were raised on human rights. And let me start with responding to the human rights questions. Let me preface that by saying that all of us, as governments and as civil society, have a responsibility for protection and promotion of human rights, and there is no end to this process. The more we protect human rights, the more we increase stability in our societies, and the more we deal and fight with violent extremism. One of the reasons Iran does not have extremists in a region filled with extremists is that people in Iran have the possibility to vent their frustrations at the ballot box, whereas many countries in our region don't know what the ballot box is and have been alien from such processes forever. You can see that in the streets. You can see that in the stability and tranquility in societies. I'm not saying that our human rights record does not need improvement, far from it. We believe that human rights can take a lot of improvements, and that's the best area where you can add the legitimacy, increase the legitimacy of the government, and enhance your stability. So we welcome a serious dialogue on human rights with the European Union. And as somebody who started a human rights dialogue with the European Union in my previous capacity as Deputy Foreign Minister when Chris Patten was the EU Commissioner for External Relations, I can be very serious in stating that I'm eager to start that dialogue. But we have to accept that that dialogue will be a mutual dialogue, not a one-way street. It will not be a monologue, and it will not be about preaching. I do not want to start by preaching about the values that we keep dear in our traditions and in our societies, and I expect not to be preached on the values that you consider to be dear, but we can engage in a serious discourse, and I believe that discourse is necessary. I believe we all need to understand why we have this extremism. We all need to understand why some who behead innocent individuals in our part of the world speak European languages with perfect accent. We all need to address that question. None of them speak Persian with perfect accent. Have you asked that question from yourselves? Why is it that this is happening? We all need to address all these questions. I'm not here for recrimination and blame game, but we have not imposed sanctions on you for violations of human rights. You have imposed them on us. So I think it would be good if you also heard in a serious dialogue what constitutes a serious discourse on human rights. And that would be extremely important. I've been teaching human rights for the past 28 years. And I know it is important for every society to grow its own homegrown human rights defenders. Not to, I didn't speak when you were speaking, madam. That's an area of respect for human rights that I think everybody should observe. I listened, everybody made their statements, and I expect to be listened to now. I believe it is important for all of us to recognize the facts as they are on the ground. For the past 37 years, in Iran, we have had 4 presidents electing their opposition into office. 4 presidents. President Rafsanjani elected President Khatami, who at the time of his election, not now, was considered President Rafsanjani's opposition. President Khatami elected who? President Ahmadinejad, who nobody doubts was his opposition. President Ahmadinejad elected President Rouhani, who was the farthest candidate from him. In all societies on whom you have not imposed sanctions, in our region, none of that has happened. The ballot box doesn't rule. So let me ask this question from you. Why have you imposed sanctions on Iran and not on anybody else? This is a question that needs to be answered if we want to deal seriously with human rights. If human rights is not going to be a subject of political maneuvering, if human rights is not going to be an issue that you beat your opponents with. I have represented Iran in the United Nations. I saw at the time when the Saddam Hussein regime of Iraq was one of the proponents of human rights in Iran, was voting along with the European Union in resolutions against Iran. And there was not a single resolution against Saddam Hussein in the United Nations. Then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and all of a sudden, he became the worst violator of human rights. Saddam was a despot, a human rights violator, but he wasn't a human rights violator because he invaded Kuwait. He invaded Kuwait because he was a human rights violator. And everybody in the international community put the cart before the horse. And I think that is where we find human rights abused in the international community and the legitimacy and credibility of the work for human rights undermined. I agree with you, the Helsinki process minus human rights doesn't work. Human rights is a legitimate concern of the international community. I agree. But then we need to respect the fact that human rights must be the determining point and not political considerations. When you go home, please consider for yourselves, if a country in our region is supposed to be under EU sanctions for human rights, should it be Iran? Just ask this question from yourselves. Should it be Iran? Or should it be the country that is bombarding the hell out of the people of Yemen? How many people have died in Yemen? You looked? More people die in Yemen on a daily basis because of Saudi bombardments than they die in Syria. Yes. Look at the statistics. Look at the statistics. Look at the statistics, sir. You've got to go and see what is happening. You cannot close your eyes. There is nothing to bomb in Yemen. Nothing other than human beings. A cement factory has been bombed 5 times. A flour factory has been bombed 4 times because there are no targets. For the past 11 months, the Yemen has been ravaged. And nothing, I know that the European Parliament has started talking about it recently. But we got to be careful when we deal with these issues. Now, on the death penalty, Iran captures, seizes 85% of the opium that is seized in the world. We were approached by the drug traffickers in the 1990s. They told us, let us transit drugs from Iran. We will not leave any residues. We will take it to Europe when it's most economical for us, most rewarding financially. We will not leave any residues. You know what they do? In Iran, the best and cheapest entertainment is drugs. They subsidize drugs in Iran. It's almost free. Almost free. It's because we do not fail in our responsibility to combat drug traffickers. It's because they bring drugs to Iran not in small, clean suitcases that you detect in your airports, but in trucks with machine guns. How do you deal with that? We're not saying that we have the best answer, but how do we want to deal with the problem of the biggest drug transit route in the world? From Afghanistan, the capital of opium production in the world, through Iran, which is the main route, to Europe. Drugs in Iran cost 1/100th of the price in the streets of Europe. We're not saying that that is the best policy. We're not saying that's the best deterrent. But we have not seen any other option. We are prepared to engage with you in counter-narcotics operations. You know that because of the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran and continue to be imposed on Iran, Iran is not given radars to detect people who are trafficking human beings and drugs into Iran from Afghanistan. We want to engage in a serious dialogue with each other on human rights and on the death penalty, let us engage in a serious dialogue. Let us engage in a serious dialogue. How we deal with that? How we deal with drug trafficking? Now, it is important. Now, as I said, no country can claim that it has a perfect record, even a good record in human rights. And I don't claim that Iran has that. We criticize many of the abuses that take place. We believe that a lot of improvement is needed in Iran. We're the first to admit that. The President has declared as a campaign promise that he wants to bring about a charter of citizens' rights. And he will be issuing that charter and will take legislative measures, will present legislation to the Parliament in order to protect better the rights of Iranian citizens. But let us deal with the realities on the ground. People are talking about disqualifications. Some of us don't like the disqualifications either. But let us look at the fact. Today, 6,000 people are running for 300 seats in the Parliament. So, over 20 contenders for each seat. I may have my personal preferences about who should have been qualified. But in all democratic societies, there is a vetting process. In some societies, money is the vetting process. If you don't have money, if you don't have contributions, in some democratic societies, you're doomed. You can never run a serious election. Unfortunately, it's the case in our society as well. It's a hugely expensive enterprise to get elected. So there are various types of vetting processes, and there is a vetting process in Iran with all its shortcomings. But the fact of the matter is that if the turnout is high in Iran, people have a serious choice to make in our parliamentary election. But we're talking about a country that has a parliament, for God's sake, that has elections, that its president is elected by the popular vote, in a region that such is an anomaly. So let me make it, I just wanted to make some points to just create some food for thought, maybe poisonous food for thought. Some of you don't like it, and I apologize. As I said, I'll be frank with you. But let me go back to the positive side and say we are ready to engage in a dialogue with the European Union on human rights based on mutual respect and based on the possibility to go back and forth. And on the death penalty as well. Let us deal with the region, because that was the second most widely asked question. And I apologize if I missed some of the questions. I should have answered one by one, but I did take notes, and the region comes second. I believe the most dangerous and erroneous concept would be to define the problem in our region as a religious or sectarian problem. It's erroneous because the sects have lived together for 14 centuries and have not engaged in this type of interaction. And it's dangerous because if you pretend that this is a sectarian problem, you will have to fight it in the streets of London and Rome and Paris. So it's both dangerous and erroneous. Let's not fall into that trap. Hey, how are you? Now you have resolved the UK problem, now you can come and join us and resolve the Iran problem. How are you? So it's not a religious problem. It's a perception by our neighbors that following the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, there is a disequilibrium in the region that they need to redress. They need to rebalance. And everything that is happening is caused by that perception of disequilibrium. And we are prepared to address that anxiety, provided that they are prepared to address it, not that they want to fight it over. Now, they've given it all the flavors of Bashar al-Assad being a democratic or undemocratic, ruthless or whatever. And you've heard all of that. But are we talking about democracies in our region criticizing Bashar al-Assad? Is any of the countries that is criticizing Bashar al-Assad in the Persian Gulf more democratic than he is? I mean, let's be serious. This is not about democracy. This is not about the rights of the Syrian people. This is all about a convoluted, perverted concept of regional equilibrium, which they believe has been disturbed and they want to redress. And I believe in the process a lot of innocent people are getting killed. So let us focus on resolving the issue. Why Iran is there? Because Iran believes that the alternative right now, either in Iraq or in Syria, is not a democratic government, but it's Daesh. And for some, they are prepared to accept Daesh in Damascus. They prefer to have Daesh in Damascus over Bashar al-Assad. What we say, it's none of our business who will be ruling Iraq, who will be ruling Syria. It's the business of the people of Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and Bahrain, who will be ruling them. We should not determine, we should not veto, we should not send troops to prevent the realization of the will of the people. We should not bombard, we should not carry an aerial campaign. Our program, our plan for Yemen is exactly our plan for Syria. It's a 4-point plan. Ceasefire, national unity government. Between the two, between ceasefire and national unity government, humanitarian assistance, which is in dire need. Ceasefire and humanitarian assistance, national unity government, intra-Syrian and intra-Yemeni talks aimed at constitutional reform so that we can ensure inclusive participation, inclusive governments in both countries. And finally, elections based on the newly revised constitution. In the process, outsiders should facilitate and not dictate. We are in no place to say who should run and who should not run, who should rule and who should not rule. It's the duty, privilege, and the right of the people of Syria and Yemen to make that decision. We should only facilitate. Now, what we have done in Yemen is that we have promoted intra-Yemeni dialogue. We have supported dialogue. Others have withdrawn from dialogue. And each time we insisted on it. In Syria, what we agreed in Vienna, what we agreed in New York, was basically based on this 4-point plan that I mentioned. And this plan has been on the table on behalf of Iran since September 2013. So had they accepted our plan instead of in Resolution 2254, which was just adopted by the United Nations 2 years ago, we would have saved a lot of lives. But people insisted that before we engage in negotiations, Bashar al-Assad should leave. Now, can you determine the outcome of a negotiation before you even start that negotiation? Is it reasonable? Or is it a recipe for prolonging the conflict? You're supposed to decide about the future of Syria around the negotiating table, not before you enter the negotiating room. Isn't that the reason for prolongation of the conflict in Syria? Do we need to prolong the conflict for another 2 years? Now that the international community, everybody, the United States and Europe have come to the realization that we need to start an intra-Syrian dialogue before we can get to an outcome, then our friends in the region are trying to torpedo that in whatever way they can. Coalitions, whatever they call it. So let's get to the reality of the situation. We have a common challenge, we have a common threat, and we have a way out. The way out is to find a political solution in Syria, to find a political solution in Yemen, because in the absence of a political solution, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and Al-Nusra will be the winners. They'll use the differences and divisions within us in order to gain more territory, as they are doing right now in Yemen. Right now in Yemen, the hold of Al-Qaeda and Daesh over Yemeni territory is greater than any time in the past. So what are we doing? I think we all need to come with a realization that Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and Al-Nusra are nobody's friends. They are nobody's leverage. They can work for no one, even to gain short-term political advantage. I mean, these are all truisms when I talk it to you, but on the field, in the operational theaters of Syria and Yemen, people think otherwise. People think a defeat by al-Nusra is a defeat for them because Assad is gaining. And that's wrong. That's a wrong zero-sum analysis. Zero-sum analysis doesn't work today in our world. So let's change the dynamic. Let's get the humanitarian assistance to the people, to all the people in Syria. There are villages that have been under siege for 4 years. Villages that were liberated in the recent operations in Aleppo had been under siege for 4 years. No access to them. 70,000 Shia population in Nobel and Az-Zahra had been under siege for 4 years. Nobody talked about them. 13 Sunni villages, not Shias, 13 Sunni villages were under Nusra siege for the past 4 years. They were liberated in the recent operation. We hear all the hue and cry about it. You know why? Because the supply line of a certain neighbor to al-Nusra has been cut. That's the strategic dimension of the loss that they try to stage as a humanitarian problem. Of course there are humanitarian problems. It's a war. It's not a game, unfortunately. It's a war which we should all try to end. As Iran, I proposed a ceasefire in the first Vienna meeting. Go check the records. Ask the countries who were represented in the ISSG. In the first Vienna meeting, Iran proposed an immediate comprehensive ceasefire. And go ask who opposed it. Ask who opposed it. Ask who said there cannot be a ceasefire. Was it anybody other than the Saudi foreign minister? The records of the meeting are clear. We proposed a ceasefire and they opposed it. Now, as far as Iran-Saudi tensions are concerned, what can we do? We can exercise self-restraint as we have. There were 2 cases in the last several months of negligence. One case of negligence by Saudi Hajj officials resulted in the death of 464 Iranian pilgrims. 464. It took us several weeks to even get the bodies back. Let's forget about apology or reparations or anything. Just the bodies. Took us several weeks to get the bodies back. We didn't break diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. We didn't even reduce diplomatic relations. We didn't recall our ambassador. Then there was another case of negligence. In the case of our police protecting Saudi embassy. Not a single individual was hurt. Not a single individual. We condemned the act. Within 6 hours, our president condemned the act. We arrested the people who were responsible for it. We demoted and removed the security officials who had committed neglect. And then within several hours, Saudi Arabia broke diplomatic relations and started pressuring and paying others to break diplomatic relations with us too. So what we can do is to exercise self-restraint as a powerful country in our region in order to have stability, because we know tension is in nobody's interest. Although some may believe that they want tension to invite foreigners to get in. Some may want, people were talking about a military solution. We have said there is no military solution to the Syrian crisis. Our Saudi neighbors are saying publicly that there is a military solution. Are they going to impose a military solution, or are they willing to fight until the last NATO soldier in order to impose a military solution? Do we know what we're talking about? Who is going to impose a military solution to Syria? Who is going? Nobody. Russia cannot impose a military solution either. Nobody can impose a military solution to Syria. We need a political solution. Russia and Iran are not talking about a military solution. We are talking about the need for a political solution. Let us bring those who believe there is a military solution to the table and try to resolve this politically around the negotiating table. Not try to impose a political decision on the Syrian people before the negotiating room. That will never work. And that will work in favor of Al-Qaeda, Daesh and al-Nusra, who are there to gain from this. So let's be serious. We want to resolve this. Iran is not interested in a sectarian conflict. We're the minority, for God's sake. No minority wants a sectarian conflict. We're the minority. We want to resolve this amicably. We want to have sectarian peace and tranquility. And we are determined to get it. We are determined to get it through dialogue, through negotiations. We have suggested a dialogue forum for the Persian Gulf. We believe that's the way to deal with the issues in our region. On Israel, which was another question that was asked. You thought I would avoid that. I believe Iran has presented a very clear analysis. We're not a player in that region, but we are an astute observer who has witnessed the policies of Zionists for the past 70 years, based on aggression, based on expansionism, based on violations of human rights. Now, the Iranian nuclear program provided a smokescreen for Netanyahu to hide behind such a smokescreen and not be accountable for the crimes that they were committing, settlements, reprisals, total annihilation of villages. Now the smokescreen is gone, and that's why he was so opposed to the nuclear deal, because he did not want the smokescreen to disappear. That was a good cover, wasn't it? Now people need to talk about the realities that are used by extremist organizations such as Daesh and al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda in order to attract new followers. We have our own analysis. We have presented our analysis in very clear terms. But it doesn't mean that we have taken any action. We have not taken any aggressive action against anybody. In the past 300 years, Iran has only defended itself, and defended itself in a most valiant way. You remember when Saddam Hussein attacked Iran? Most of you do not want to remember that. When Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, everybody provided him with weapons. Nobody even provided Iran with the means of defense. And you ask us why we develop our missiles? How do we defend ourselves? What are the means that are left for Iran to defend itself? And Resolution 1929, my friend, is defunct today. It's not operative anymore. Today we have Resolution 2231, which does not make Iran, but just calls upon Iran, it's no longer mandatory, not to produce missiles that are designed to be capable, not capable, designed to be capable of carrying nuclear weapons. We do not have nuclear warheads, so we are not designing anything to carry nuclear warheads that we do not have. But missiles are the means of our defense. If you're concerned about military expenditures, go talk to your governments not to sell so much military hardware to our region. $130 billion worth of military hardware is being sold to the Persian Gulf region alone. This is not my figure, this is Secretary John Kerry's figure. And the highest estimate of Iranian military expenditure is $15 billion. And we have a population of all those countries combined together. We have armed forces which exceeds their armed forces combined together, but we spend the 10th of their military expenditure. We are entitled to our defense within the norms of international law. But we are prepared to cut defense spendings in the region mutually, not one-sided. We are already spending a fraction of what others are spending on military hardware. So if missiles are the means of our defense, we're not targeting anybody. We're targeting anybody who attacks us, so that they won't attack us. Because we were attacked and everybody stayed quiet. We were bombarded with chemical weapons and everybody kept their mouth shut for 8 years. Maybe you want to forget it. We can't. We can't forget it in Iran. We can't forget the fact that I went to the President of the Security Council. This is a personal experience. I went to the President of the Security Council in 1986 and told him, Mr. President, Iran is being bombarded with chemical weapons, and he said, I can't listen to you. And you know, as long as Saddam Hussein was in office and in Iran, violating our territorial integrity, there is no single Security Council resolution condemning his use of chemical weapons. The first Security Council resolution on Saddam's use of chemical weapons was issued after the end of our war. So I think it's important, while Iran wants to work with the international community, while Iran is open to work with Europe to reduce the concerns and tensions in the region, believe me, we're not the ones who have to gain your trust. We both need to gain each other's trust. We both need to work at it very hard. Now we have set the first foundation for that trust, and we did our part. The IAEA verified that Iran complied and even over-complied with its obligation way before the time it was supposed to comply. Nobody expected us to comply by January 16th. We did. And there is not a single complaint that we didn't do exactly everything that we were asked to do. So we did our part of the bargain, and we're proud of it. I believe EU has started playing its part of the bargain. We still need together to work with the United States, Iran and the EU together, to work with the US to make the US perform its part of the bargain, which is in your interest as much as it's in our interest. And we can build on this foundation in order to address the problems and calamities in our region which are affecting you. The refugee problem, we understand the refugee problem is affecting you because we host 3 million of them. This year we have 370,000 illegal Afghan students attending our primary and secondary schools. So we understand what you're talking about when you talk about refugees. We feel it, exactly as you do. And we are prepared to work with you in order to alleviate this concern at its birthplace, that is Syria, by finding a political solution. But let us walk this road together. Let us not assume that any side requires greater effort. We all require a lot of effort in order to move on the right path. And I believe we have started that path. And I believe we can go on that path together. And I believe we need to go on that path together. And I believe we will succeed, as we succeeded in the nuclear negotiations. Only Iran and EU believed from the beginning that we will succeed in that negotiations, and we did. And we can succeed in this struggle if we try to look at it from the right perspective. Sorry to be long-winded.
Foreign Minister, thank you very much for your readiness to talk to us, discuss with us, and explain your position to us. I know that this is the first visit of you to the European Parliament, European institutions, after the conclusion of the agreement, which is the agreement is a very step forward, and as you said rightly, we have to find the trust of each other. This is was an important step of that, and we're also ready, as we said in our visit in Tehran in the summer, that from the side of the Parliament we want to continue that, and that we want to come also to working relations with your Parliament. And therefore I think we will find a framework to do so. The situation in the Middle East, we have to say, people die at the moment. And part of the reason is a proxy war there. And I'm not ready to say who is more wrong in that and less wrong. In this situation of dramatic situation and human tragedies, we should find a solution so fast as possible, and I see the Russian intervention there is to win time to create facts, which make it difficult more to make it possible, more difficult to find a solution so fast as possible and not have more human tragedies. And therefore we ask, without saying who is right or wrong, that we have all to come together, the Americans, the Russians, the Europeans, the Saudis and the Iranians, and all groups in that region, in order to stop that because of a lot of reasons. And that is where we ask for. And I'm not interested to say that side is more right or more wrong. Find a solution that I think is our common approach which we have to find. Thank you very much again for coming, and have a safe journey home.
Thank you.